Welcome to the West Ham Voice. Thank you for joining me on a Sunday morning. I wasn't going to do a video today, but I read the article by Jacob Steinberg in The Guardian, the column he wrote, the article he wrote about West Ham struggles in the summer transfer window. And I found it really interesting. And I found myself sort of responding to it on Twitter. And then before I knew it, said I was going to do a video to cover what I thought maybe one or two things that were missing in that article, which to give a bigger, the wider picture of what seems to be going on, certainly from my perspective. I'm not saying it's right. Now, while this article was interesting and covered what many of us already knew, it was disappointing for me that Steinberg didn't take time to elaborate on what Steidten's full remit in transfers might be at West Ham United. What exactly is his role for this summer? Explaining this may offer fans a better understanding of the current situation and may help to prevent fans from going into yet another meltdown, especially on social media platforms. Now, I want to say from the outset, this video is not an attack on Steinberg. Absolutely not. Steinberg is an awful lot better connected to what goes on at West Ham United than I ever will be. And I do actually respect and admire a lot of the articles that he writes. In fact, I agree with a lot of what Steinberg has written, and much of what he wrote is no different to what I've said in a video that I did just recently. So let's go into some of the specifics and some of the things that I think maybe are kind of missing. Now, when it comes to transfers, we all agree that a replacement for Declan Rice should have been identified as early as last summer. And as I said in my video, the main targets should have been approached with immediate offers. And if the first target couldn't be pinned down, then you move on to the next target and so on. Now, it's been suggested that we did approach one target, Edson Alvarez, the day after the Europa Conference League final. And the hold-up is more about agent demands than anything else. Now, whether this is true or not, whether we actually did approach him after the Europa Conference League final or not, I can't corroborate it. I read it in an article, but I can't tell you if it's fact because, of course, sometimes you read things on social media and they're not all true, are they? But if that is the case, it kind of shows that we have been pushing forward with our transfer business for some time, but things just haven't come about, haven't materialized for one reason or another. But it's also correct to say that after a month of no signings, there does now seem to be a desperate scattergun approach to our transfer search, and Steinberg is not wrong there. Reading Steinberg's article several times over to get a better understanding of it, I don't believe it suggests to me that he's actually blaming David Moyes for the transfer stalemate that we're in. But I could be wrong there. And it doesn't. It does look like, however, to me, that most of the fan base is thinking just that it is all David Moyes' fault. Now, in fact, one can't help but wonder whether Steinberg is making a subtle hint that the transfer problems that we're currently facing have actually been created by David Sullivan. I would imagine that these conversations involving Steidten's remit for the summer must have been had. Would he be involved in summer transfer business? And if so, what decision making would he have had? Or was there an understanding that this summer is all about David Moyes and the targets that he wants, and that Steidten would maybe have an input, or not maybe, will have an input in longer term plans for the club in the future? Now, it's highly possible that Steidten asked for clarity on his role regarding transfers, and maybe David Sullivan painted a very different picture as to the level of input that Steidten would have. But I simply can't believe that Steidten wouldn't have asked for that clarity before signing on the dotted line on his West Ham contract. Now, and if what Sullivan has told him is now different to what's happening, then this isn't on David Moyes and his stubbornness in the transfer market. It would seem to be more on Sullivan for having misled Steidten during those initial conversations. So perhaps if Steidten is frustrated, then maybe it's not just being frustrated at David Moyes, but also perhaps frustrated at Sullivan for misleading him. After all, the person who said that Steidten finds Moyes hard work is the senior source himself. Do we take his word for it? In addition to seeking clarity on his role in summer transfers, I would also imagine that Steidten would have wanted to meet David Moyes, given that the two men would be working closely together. So surely Steidten and Moyes must have had discussions about how transfers would work this summer. They must have had a kind of agreed plan of action, who would make transfer recommendations, who would have final say, and so on. Because you see, if Steidten was given an inkling that Moyes would have total control of transfers this summer, then maybe that might have made him decide that this wasn't the role for him to take on. Now, all of this was actually highlighted, but like I said, in videos that I've done, but also by Gio on Hammer's chat. And I'm sorry, Gio, I know I'll kind of plagiarize some of what you've said, but it kind of makes sense. And it would be an area that, as a journalist, I would imagine that Steinberg would have some insight on. All these conversations being had before Steidten came to work for West Ham. You know, he's close to the club. So I would imagine that he's got close enough connections to have an inkling that these conversations were being had. Steinberg's article also didn't cover how Steidten came to be technical director of West Ham. You know, what is Steidten's wider remit? What's he also likely to be responsible for beyond just transfers? And what may have swayed him to join West Ham's roller coaster in the first place? Again, I've talked about this in my previous video, which is why I think Steidten is here for the long term. You see, a technical director's role goes beyond transfers. A technical director isn't concerned about the here and now and immediate results. He's assigned to look at the bigger picture. What way's the club heading? What transfer policy do we want to implement going forward? Will we adopt, for example, a Brighton type of transfer approach? The technical director would also be involved in things like helping to shape the academy, development squads. And most important task in his remit will almost certainly be to look for David Moyes' replacement at this season end. There are no short-term plans. These are all long-term plans, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc., or even longer, which are the types of projects that appeal to Steidten and ones that he's overseen at previous clubs at Werder Bremen and Bayer Leverkusen. So being so close, as I've said, to the club, what's happening, etc., I would imagine that Steinberg would have been privy to or had some insight into meetings and conversations that must have been held between Steidten and Sullivan before Steidten agreed to join the club. And I would hope that those conversations would have covered what Steidten's role would be. A person of Steidten's caliber isn't going to agree to come to West Ham United without having a clear vision on what the remit is. What role would he play? What input he would have at the club, in areas like transfers and beyond that. It's a bit like a job interview, where sure, the employer is going to want to get to know you as a candidate and whether get to know whether you have the right skills and credentials for the role that you're applying for. But at the same time, a good job interview would also include a section whereas the interviewee would have an opportunity to ask questions about the job, to ensure that it's the right fit for you and that it will meet your expectations. What's the salary? What will my duties be? What will my objectives be? What targets do you want me to achieve? And so on and so forth. I'd be immensely surprised if Steidten didn't take the opportunity to ask for that clarity before coming to West Ham. Now, having said all that, there seems to be a bit of a contradiction on one of the bits that he wrote in his article, and that was about Harvey Barnes. Now, Steinberg suggested that the club had been working on the Barnes transfer since April, and that was way before Steidten arrived on the scene. Then, with the arrival of Steidten, there was a reset in our transfer business, which resulted in the opportunity to sign the winger being lost. So, who hit the reset button? If Barnes was a target way back, that means Moyes and possibly Rob Newman would have identified him as one. And given that we keep being told that Moyes is fully in charge of transfers, then why not just complete the deal? What would have been the point of hitting the reset button? And more importantly, who was it that hit that reset button? Moyes, Sullivan, Steidten? Well, by definition, if Steidten is not having any input in transfer decisions, then it couldn't have been him. Because if it was Steidten, then that would suggest that he does have a say in transfers after all. So which is it? It seems to me that if Moyes wanted the player and if Steidten wasn't even involved in the discussions way back in April, then I can only imagine that the only other person that would have hit that reset button is David Sullivan himself. Possible? I don't know. Now, for me, it seems a bit weird because it kind of then questions whether Steidten is or isn't involved in transfers. There is, of course, the conversation or the deal that we've been hearing about of Carlos Borges joining West Ham United. And perhaps that could have affected the signing of Harvey Barnes. If Moyes really wanted Barnes and then was overruled to agree on the signing of Borges instead, then that might be a further indication that Steidten does have some say in the transfer market this summer. I believe there's likely to be. An agreement that Moyes is actually responsible for transfers this summer, and because he is responsible for the delivering on the pitch, for results, and he's going to want to work with players that he's going to feel more comfortable with. I think he probably thinks that we've got a good enough squad for Europe, but it's the Premier League that he needs to focus on strengthening the squad for. Hence the targets we're linked to. Moyes quite correctly has to focus on this season because when it ends, he will be saying farewell no matter what we do. So for him, his reputation's on the line. He's going to want to walk away without being a failure in the Premier League this next season. So it doesn't surprise me that Moyes is targeting the type of players that he does. But Steinberg's article has fallen into the same trap that I and many other fans have also fallen into. The belief that Premier League players are only Moyes signings and that players from Europe are Steidten signings. Well, you only got to look at our current squad to realise that this isn't the case. Because under Moyes, we've signed Soufal, Agurd, Soucek, Paqueta, Scamacca and Kehrer from European clubs. And apart from Scamacca, all the others are getting their fair share of game time in the team. That was short, sweet. I hope I've kind of explained why I think there were bits missing in the Steinberg article. You may not agree, but it'd be good to hear your views and your comments and your point of view. So do leave them after watching this show. Thank you for watching. I'll be back for the West Ham Weekly on Monday night. It's a live show for those of you who aren't aware. So do come on and watch that and get involved in the chat as well. Thank you for watching. Have a great Sunday, and I'll see you all very soon.